You can see my screen now, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So we'll be looking.
I still can't.
Sorry.
It's not coming up on my side.
Okay. How about now? How about now, Michelle?
Yeah, the same
You can't.
thing.
Okay.
Well,
That was
there.
Voila today.
I don't know what the problem is with Microsoft. And
But
the
you
rest.
can see. But Akma can see, right?
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah.
Uh-uh.
Let me start share. Let me share again.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm starting the sharing again. Let me know when you can see.
Ahmad can see it.
Uh-uh. Why is it not popping up? Okay, maybe we can just start, right? Oh, hey, it's coming up
Okay.
now. I've seen it. Same
Okay.
requirements,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eliciting
Eliciting
requirements.
requirements.
Yeah. Thank
Okay.
God,
Awesome.
finally.
So today we'll be looking at eliciting requirements, and what we popularly call it in the local market is requirement gathering. So is either you hear people call it requirement gathering or requirement elicitation. So they're the same thing, but the technical and standard way of representing it is requirement elicitation or eliciting requirements. That is the best. That's because gathering requirements is a lot more restrictive in its terminology. It means you're just gathering the requirement, gathering them, getting the requirements. But eliciting requirements is not just about discovering or identifying requirements. It also involves defining the requirements. So today we'll be looking at requirement elicitation or eliciting requirements. And requirement elicitation basically is a process of discovering and researching the requirements of a system from users, from customers, and from stakeholders. In short, it involves the process of discovering the requirements, researching the requirement, and defining the requirements from stakeholders, right? And that is why I think I mentioned it in the first session we had that as business analysts, we collaborate or we engage stakeholders a lot. That's because we are not expected to know or do everything all by ourselves. We are expected to work with people to achieve an expected goal. Why do we elicit requirements? We elicit requirements to understand the business needs. The business needs in terms of the goals of the business, in terms of the scope of the business, in terms of the objectives of the business, in terms of the problems or opportunities for the business. We also elicit requirements to understand the process of the business and the needs of stakeholders. So we want to know what process has the business or does the business currently use to accomplish this particular piece of work. So let's say, for instance, we want to improve the recruitment processes or recruitment process of UpTrust, right? And then the first thing is for us to elicit requirements. In eliciting requirements, we need to understand what is the current process that UpTrust uses in hiring or recruiting staff or employee. So requirement elicitation is done for us to understand the business process or the needs of the stakeholders. These are the reasons why we need to elicit requirements. Another reason why we need to elicit requirements is for us to be able to identify potential risks that are associated with the project and with the solution. So we don't just elicit requirements for the sake of um, understanding the business process or stakeholder needs or business objectives or goals. We also want to understand, are there potential risks, right? In terms of project risks, in terms of business risks, in terms of resource risks that are associated with the initiative that we'll be working on, that we're about to embark on. And for us to effectively elicit requirements, there are 3 key steps or activities that we need to carry out to have a smooth and an efficient requirement elicitation activity. Number 1 will be for us to prepare for that elicitation activity. So we need to prepare for requirement elicitation. Number 2 will be for us to actually conduct the elicitation activity. So after preparing for elicitation, we need to carry out elicitation activity. And number 3 will be for us now communicate the result of elicitation, and then collaborate with stakeholders to ensure that they have a common and shared understanding of that elicitation. So let's start by looking at preparing for elicitation, right? What are the things we do as a business analyst in order for us to prepare for an elicitation activity for requirement gathering? Number 1 is that the first thing we need to do, or why we actually need to prepare for elicitation, is that it helps us to understand the scope of the elicitation activity. So if you don't effectively prepare, and they say to be forewarned is to be forearmed, right? So if you are aware, or if you plan yourself ahead of an event or ahead of an activity, it will help you to get the best out of it, and to help you to be able to eliminate every form of surprises that might spring up. So you need to understand the scope of that elicitation activity. What is the scope of this elicitation? Is this elicitation based on a business process? Is it based on understanding users' user experience with respect to a particular feature of the product? Is it based on understanding the technical capabilities of the product? Is it based on understanding stakeholder needs for this solution? So you need to understand the scope of the elicitation activity. You need to also plan adequately for the elicitation, and that is why we prepare. If you don't prepare for your elicitation activity, it means you've not planned for your elicitation activity. And they say when you fail to plan, you're basically planning to fail, right? So you ensure you plan adequately for the elicitation activity, and that is why we elicit requirements. We also prepare for elicitation because we want to effectively prepare our stakeholders. It is very, very important. A good reason is this. Talking based on my experience, I remember there was a time I had to go elicit requirements with a client, and I had to go to their office to meet with various process owners in different departments to understand how they currently do things in that department, and then come with a recommendation on areas we can introduce automation for them, right? So when I first got there and then I engaged them, I told them I want to elicit requirements. They obviously don't know the essence of the requirement elicitation activity. So they felt maybe I just came to interrogate them to get to understand how they do their work and how they respond to their customers and all of that. Now, when I started the elicitation activity, I realized that these stakeholders were not forthcoming. Like, they were not responding to my questions. They were not welcoming. They were not forthcoming, basically, right? They don't want to provide me with the information that I needed. So I sensed a bit of tension. And what I had to do was I had to bring them all together, and I now went on to explain to them the essence of the activity that I was doing. And it was there and then I got to know that they felt as though I was coming to understand what they are doing so that I can give a feedback to their boss if they are doing their job well or if they're not doing their job well. And if they're not doing their job well, basically, I recommend that they sack them, or if they just had this negative feel to the whole concept of the requirement elicitation. And that was where I got to understand that I should have actually prepared these stakeholders before I come to engage them for the requirement elicitation activity. So it is important for us to effectively prepare our stakeholders, and that is why we need to prepare for elicitation. Now, in preparing for elicitation, there are 5 steps or 5 things we need to do to effectively prepare for elicitation. Number 1 is to understand the scope of the elicitation. Number 2 is to select an elicitation technique. Number 3 is to set up logistics for that elicitation activity. Number 4 is to secure and capture supporting materials that will be helpful to us in the course of the elicitation. And number 5 is to prepare stakeholders for that elicitation. So we're going to take a look at these 5 steps, one after the other, or 5 things we need to do to successfully prepare for elicitation. We'll take a look at them, starting with understanding the scope of the elicitation activity. In understanding the scope of elicitation activity, it basically involves us to have an understanding of the business domain. So let me use a good example for Ahmad. Ahmad have a vast understanding and experience in the education industry, right? Now, if Ahmad as a business analyst, if you happen to find yourself in a project that involves the development or building of a financial services solution, let's say, for instance, a credit risk management solution, right? That's that will be layered on top of a credit engine or a credit management or credit scoring engine that will allow borrowers to request for credit, and then we review the application of the borrowers, issue them a credit score, approve the credit, disburse the credit, and all of that. For Ahmad to effectively carry out a requirement elicitation in this project, he will first need to have an understanding of that. He first need to have an understanding of how credit risk management or credit management business domain process or business functions, right? It will require you to at least go online to research about credit management, what credit management is all about, and what have you, right? And because if you're unable to have an understanding of, or if you don't have an understanding of the business domain, you won't be able to have a professional conversation or ask intelligent questions during your elicitation activity. So for us to understand the scope of the elicitation activity, the first thing we need to do is for us to understand the business domain. So like Michelle having a legal background as well as a real estate experience, if you are to work as a business analyst in a project that you need to deliver an EMR. EMR stands for electronic medical record, or you can also call it an HIMS, health information management system or solution, which will be used by medical facilities or medical institutions. If Mitchell is to work in that project successfully, before she even goes ahead to start eliciting requirements with stakeholders, she will need to have an understanding of the business domain. So you need to do some research, you need to do some fact-finding to understand what are the various clinical processes in a medical facility, who are the various stakeholders in a medical facility, what is the typical process for triage, and all of that. So you need to understand the business domain. You need to be able to identify your stakeholders. So who are my stakeholders? Where are they located? What are their group dynamics? You need to be able to understand the expectation of the elicitation activity. So in this elicitation activity, what is expected of me as a business analyst? I'm expected to be the one to ask the questions, to get to the root cause of the problem and what have you. So you need to understand the expectation of the elicitation activity and also understand possible sources of the information you need as a business analyst. Sometimes all of the sources of the information for the business analysis work might not just be from stakeholders. You might also get other possible sources from regulators, from existing systems, and even from online. So you need to be able to identify the possible sources of your business analysis information. After you've been able to understand the scope of the elicitation activity, you then need to select a technique. And in selecting an elicitation technique, it's important for you to select a technique that you have used in similar initiatives, or if you have not done that initiative in the past, you can select a technique that has worked for you in the past as a business analyst. Most times the go-to elicitation technique has always been interview, right? People prefer interview as a low-hanging fruit for elicitation, right? So you can engage in an interview to be able to elicit your requirements. After selecting your elicitation technique, then you need to set up logistics. You need to be able to articulate the goal of the elicitation activity. You need to be able to set up possible communication channels. So one thing I used to do whenever I start a project with a vendor or with a third-party service provider, I always tell them, let's establish a communication channel. And the most common one I used to recommend has always been Slack. So we use Slack as a communication channel, which helps in ease of communication and flow of communication during the course of the project, right? So you need to set up a communication channel. You also need to schedule resources. If the elicitation activity is going to be a physical elicitation activity, and the stakeholders and the elicitation activity will be holding in your place of work, then you need to be able to secure office space or meeting rooms for that particular elicitation activity. If it is going to be virtual, you should try as much as possible to set up virtual meeting invites and block the calendar for your stakeholders so that they are well cut out to know that elicitation activity will happen during this period in time. The fourth thing you need to do is to secure supporting materials. Supporting materials can be in terms of people. There'll be sometimes that I go for requirement elicitation and I'll take along my compliance analyst, or I'll go along with a network engineer, someone you feel that can help provide more context to the client or to the stakeholders in terms of the elicitation activity. Supporting materials could also be other systems that helps you. Maybe you take a demo version or a limited version of the product to use to walk stakeholders through the elicitation activity. And this happens mostly when you are using prototyping as an elicitation technique. So you take a demo version of the solution and then use it to elicit further requirements for that particular solution. Another supporting material could be historical data, right? You could go to the existing system and get historical data about the customers, or about the client, or about the solution you want to enhance. And with the use of that historical data, you can use to build upon your elicitation activity. And then the last one is documents or supporting materials. For instance, if there are policies or SLAs that have been signed with respect to that particular, excuse me, with respect to that particular project, you can get those policy documents, those SLAs, go along with them during your elicitation activity, and you can reference them as reference materials during elicitation. Now, the last step to preparing for elicitation will be for you to prepare stakeholders. And in preparing your stakeholders, just as I said, after the incident that happened with me, with those guys in that elicitation activity, what I had to do was, going forward, for every elicitation activity I want to embark, I first of all send out a mail to my stakeholders that will be involved in that elicitation activity to prepare them, to educate, to inform them on the scope and objectives of that elicitation activity. So in preparing your stakeholders, you need to educate them on the expectations of the elicitation activity. That takes us to the next section, which is to conduct elicitation itself. And in this section, we'll be looking at different techniques for eliciting requirements. But before we go into this session, I would like to know if you have any question whatsoever with respect to preparing for elicitation.
No, no questions.
Right, how about you, Ahmad?
None at my hand too.
So you understand what it means to prepare for elicitation, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. So you're going into the technical aspect, which is to conduct the elicitation, right? And in conducting elicitation, you need to be very particulate about the kind of technique you choose. right? The technique you choose will largely be dependent on the manner or the type of elicitation you want to conduct, right? So in terms of elicitation, there are 3 different types of elicitation. Now, don't confuse types of elicitation with techniques of elicitation. Techniques of elicitation come under the different types of elicitation. So depending on the type of elicitation you want to do, that will determine the technique you're going to adopt. So there are 3 different types of elicitation. Number 1 is collaborative elicitation. And as the name goes, collaborative, it means you want to collaborate, engage, involve stakeholders, work with stakeholders in that elicitation activity. Number 2 is research elicitation. In research elicitation, you are kind of trying to do fact finding by searching the web to obtain or discover information relevant to that particular project. And then number 3 is experiments, experimentation elicitation. In this type of elicitation technique, you are trying to you're trying to work on different hypotheses and you're trying to elicit requirements based on something you are trying to you're a form of experimenting to see if this works or this doesn't work. So you're trying to use something that you can see or something that exists and trying to see if if it actually works or if we need to improve upon it. So in that way, you get stakeholders' feedback on their requirements. So let's take a look at the different techniques of requirement. There are several techniques of requirements, so many of them. If you look at the Babok V3, you see several techniques for eliciting requirements. But we're looking at the 8 most common techniques that are used in the industry or used in the business analysis world today to elicit requirements. Number 1 is benchmarking. Number 2 is research. Number 3 is interviews. Number 4 is workshop. Number 5 is focus group. Number 6 is survey and questionnaires. Number 7 is prototyping. And number 8 is brainstorming. So we'll take a look at all of these techniques, one after the other, to understand what do they mean and when do we use them, right? So starting with benchmarking. Benchmarking basically involves eliciting requirements from an existing solution or eliciting requirements from an existing business that we have considered to be of standard. Let me give an instance. So if we want to build a ride hailing or ride sharing platform like the likes of Uber and Bolt or Uber and Taxify or Uber and Lyft, it's a no-brainer and it's also common sense for us to use the Uber as a benchmark in building our own solution because Uber or Bolt are considered to be a standard ride hailing or ride sharing business, right? So we can basically elicit requirements from the Uber platform to see what are the core features of the Uber platform. How does customers, or should I say riders, request for a ride? How does drivers accept a ride request? You know, we can elicit all of those requirements from the Uber application. We can also look at their business process. How do they go about onboarding new drivers? How do they go about their marketing and all of that? So we can leverage them or consider them to be a standard business or a standard solution. And through benchmarking basically means discovering or eliciting or gathering requirements from an existing solution that we've considered to be a standard business or standard solution, or an existing business we consider to be standard. There are three different approaches to benchmarking, but there are actually 2 types of benchmarking: internal and external benchmarking. And then there are 3 approaches to benchmarking. You can look at benchmarking from the process standpoint. So you are looking at, you're trying to benchmark the business process of a company or the product or solution you consider to be standard. So in that scenario, you're performing process benchmarking. Or you can look at it from a strategic standpoint, and you're looking in that situation, you're considering it to be a strategy benchmarking. Or from a performance standpoint, where you want to improve the efficiency or performance of an existing solution, we can now perform what we call performance benchmarking. The next elicitation technique we'll be looking at is research. Research involves building upon a collective body of knowledge. It involves capturing or gathering both qualitative and quantitative information, right? Quantitative information involves statistical information, like statistical data, while qualitative information involves information you get from the primary source, which is people like you and I. So the information that talks about how the feeling and the thinking of people, while quantitative information requires statistical data that you need to extrapolate. Now, there are two types of research: primary research and secondary research. Primary research involves doing research or getting information directly from people. When doing primary research, we are doing things like survey to get information directly from people. But secondary research, which is also another name for desk research, involves scouting or scouring around the web to get information about something. So you are making a Google search. You are searching online, reading articles and blogs and newspapers, reading columns online to get information about something. That is secondary research. Now, the next type of elicitation technique, which by far is the most common type of elicitation technique, is interview. Interview allows us for in-depth one-on-one conversation or discussion with stakeholders in order for us to understand their thinking, their thoughts, their perspective, and their opinion. So we have a one-on-one conversation with stakeholders. It also allows us to have a good feel of what they think, of what they believe, or their rationale behind a piece of information. Or it could be unstructured, depending on the approach you want to follow. Interviews involve starting with open-ended questions and then concluding with a close-ended question or set of close-ended questions. I'll show you guys examples of, or should I say, sample open-ended questions that we use in interviews. For open-ended questions, this relates to questions that start with. This relates to questions that start with who, why, where, how, when, and what. Right? These are called open-ended questions. So any question you are asking, and the question starts with why, or who, or where, or when, or what, we consider those questions to be open-ended questions. So at the end of the class, we'll take a look at, or at the end of this section, we'll take a look at sample open-ended questions we use for interviews. Now, the next elicitation technique we are going to be looking at is what we call workshop. Workshop is another common type of elicitation technique that we use as business analysts to elicit requirements. Basically involves gathering previously identified stakeholders in a structured setting for a particular period of time in order for us to elicit, in order for us to refine, and in order for us to edit requirements. So we can conduct workshop to either elicit requirements or to refine a requirement that has been elicited, or to even make an edit on a requirement that we feel needs to be updated. And by edit, I mean to update a requirement. Some organizations, they consider workshop to be a joint application or design session. Some also take workshop to be a sprint planning a sprint refinement session, where we kind of refine the user stories and the features that we need to implement for that particular sprint. So depending on the organization you find yourself, some might call it a JAD, joint application design session. Some might call it a sprint refinement session. Just know that they are all considered to be workshop. Another elicitation technique we'll be looking at is focus group. Focus group consists of a mix of pre-qualified stakeholders who gather to offer input on the business need at hand and its potential solution. For a focus group, you most likely have to incentivize stakeholders that are involved in a focus group activity. Also, a focus group consists of a minimum of 6 participants and a maximum of 12 participants. So when you are organizing a focus group, you must ensure that you have a minimum of 6 participants and a maximum of 12 participants. So you can have 6 people, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12 persons participate in a focus group. Difference between a focus group and a workshop is that for a workshop involves stakeholders that are directly in workshop involves gathering stakeholders that are part of the project, right? So you gather stakeholders that are part of that particular project. But in focus group, the stakeholders that are involved in the focus group are not involved in the project. They are not part of the project team. They are basically users, end users that you have pre-identified and pre-qualified to join the elicitation activity for the focus group. The essence basically is for you to be able to understand how users perceive or how stakeholders perceive the use of your solution. Another elicitation technique that we have is brainstorming. Brainstorming is another popular technique that I love so much. It's one of my best elicitation technique. I prefer to brainstorm than just um, than just do focus group or conduct interviews, because through brainstorm and sometimes it depends on what you are trying to achieve. If you are trying to find out how to solve a problem, the best technique will be going through brainstorming. If you are trying to find out how the implementation for a particular requirement should go, the best technique would be workshop. If you are trying to find out the business need for a particular project, the business need or the stakeholder need for a particular project, the best technique will be interview or research. So depending on the end result for you for that elicitation, that will determine the kind of elicitation, the type of elicitation technique that you're going to be using. So brainstorming involves making efforts to find a conclusion for a specific problem by gathering a list of ideas spontaneously. That's list of ideas spontaneously contributed by its members. So you have your team members or stakeholders gathered in the office or in the room, and then you begin to spontaneously come up with creative ideas on how to solve a particular problem. So brainstorming encourages creativity and innovation. Another elicitation technique that we're looking at is survey and questionnaire. Survey and questionnaire is a type of research elicitation, right? When you're doing research elicitation, you can use surveys and questionnaires for it. Surveys and questionnaires for it. So it requires you mapping out questions and sharing them with stakeholders to get responses regarding the areas of that particular initiatives. Surveys and questionnaires can include both open-ended and closed-ended questions. But depending on the size of your survey and also the size of the stakeholders you want to respond to your survey, that will determine the amount or the number of open-ended questions you're going to be having in your survey. So let's say, for instance, you plan to have about 100 persons respond to your survey or 100 audience for your survey. It means that you are going to have lesser open-ended question, but more close-ended questions. But if you have just 5 or 8 persons responding to your survey or 10 persons responding to your survey, then you can have more open-ended questions and less close-ended questions. Another technique we'll be looking at is prototype. So prototype is an experimental type of elicitation that involves you walking stakeholders through a sample of the proposed solution in order for you to get their feedback. And through that feedback mechanism, you capture further requirements for that solution. Example of ways things we do for prototype is you can design a mock-up, right, of the solution and then prototype it, then walk stakeholders through the mock-up and allow them to give you feedback on that particular solution. Another way is to get a low version of that particular solution and walk stakeholders through that low version of the solution in order to get their feedback on that. Now, I would like to know if you have any question on the various elicitation techniques that we've just looked at before I walk you guys through some sample elicitation questions, especially open-ended questions for interview.
We
Any
need
questions?
we need to go ahead. We need to revisit this recording so that we can digest and learn more. So I think we should go ahead with the sampling.
So am I fast? Am I being so fast?
No. It's not that we are fast. You know, we are getting load of information and the important knowledge and nuggets here. So we need to sit back, rewatch, learn better, and you know. So that's my opinion. So I think we should go ahead with the sample elicitation questions.
Michelle?
Yeah.
Do you have any question?
No, none for now.
Okay. All right. So let's go into the sample elicitation question. Number one, we'll take a look at the who questions. For the who type to understand the stakeholders, the users, right? Who will be using the system. So we are asking questions like who will be using the system, who will be using each process, who can provide this information to us, who can access what data, who are the partners or who are the competitors, who will approve a particular process and who will initiate the process, who are we providing these services to, and who has the privilege to terminate a particular process. So when we are asking who questions, we are basically trying to understand the person involved in a particular scenario. It might be in terms of usage of a system, it might be in terms of terminating a process, starting a process, approving a process. For the what question, or sorry, for the how question, we are trying to understand processes, sequence, steps. When we understand the process of which customers will sign up, you can say, how do you want customers to sign up? Or how do you want customers to create accounts, right? How does users complete these tasks? How is the data going to be stored? So you want to know the process of data storage. How will users have access to the solution? How have you been doing this in the past? How do you want this to be done by customers? How do you want to measure success for this particular process? How long will it take to complete this process? How should the reports look like? And how long will the service last? How much do you estimate as a potential revenue or as a potential profit or the potential value that users can get from this project. Now, for the when questions, in terms of when questions, you're trying to understand duration, you're trying to understand frequency, you're trying to understand timing. And for when question, you have things like when does the process start? So you want to know when it actually starts. You want to know also when does this process end as well? When do users have to perform this action, and when will users have access to this particular information? So with when questions, they're trying to understand frequency, duration, timing of a particular event, right? And it's an open-ended question that allows your stakeholders to provide a lot more questions. So let me give an instance. If I ask you, when does this process end? You have the comfort of explaining to me when the process ends. You start by saying the process will end when the customer does this, provided that they have done this, and they can also do this as well. So you can actually give me a lot more context or information when I ask you, when does this process end? But if I reframe the question with a close-ended question and say, does this process end after users have clicked, after a user have verified their email? So with the way I frame the questions again, it means that I'm expecting a yes or no from you. So it's a close-ended question that needs the user to respond with either a yes or a no. But if I should ask you, when does this process end? I'm not expecting a yes or no answer from you. I'm expecting you to give me context on that particular process. Another elicitation open-ended question we ask is the why questions. And in the why question, we are trying to understand the rationale, the reason, things in terms of why do users need to complete this task? Why should the process start here? Why should the process end here? And basically, most times you imply or you apply the 5 why techniques. The 5 why techniques basically involves intelligently asking why in 5 sequences. For instance, if I ask you, let me say, for instance, if I say, Michelle, have you had lunch? Can you answer? So, Michelle, have you had lunch today?
No, not yet. No, I haven't.
Why haven't you had lunch? So why haven't you had lunch? Like why? Why have you not had lunch today?
I'm just waiting for maybe for the class to end.
So you're waiting for the class to end so you have lunch. So why do you want to wait for the class to end before you can have your lunch?
Because I prefer to have my lunch around 2 p.m., which is probably when the class is going to end.
Why do you prefer to have a lunch around 2 or 3 p.m.?
Because that's the most suitable time for me.
Why is that?
Why do you think it's the most suitable time for you?
Okay, I think because I'm already accustomed to it right from when I was working with a particular firm. So that's when we usually have our lunch break. So I just got like accustomed. My body somehow got accustomed to having my lunch around 2 p.m.
Okay, now, so you realize that the first answer you gave to me is not actually the answer to that my question, right?
Yeah.
But by asking you why severally, I'm gradually getting to the root cause or to the main reason why you've not had lunch.
Okay.
So your reason for not having lunch is not because of the training.
Yes.
Your reason for not having lunch is not because you want to wait till 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. Maybe your reason for having lunch might be because your body is used to having lunch around 2, 3 p.m.
Exactly.
So I can still go further and ask you, why do you think your body has gotten used to having lunch by 2 to 3 p.m.? And you see that another reason will come up. And that is why the 5 why techniques is used to drill down to the root cause analysis. This is where when we are trying to understand root cause analysis. So most times when you ask stakeholders, why do you want the sign up button to have a an orange color. They might say, oh, I love orange. Orange is appealing. And I ask them, why do you think orange is appealing? So by the time you ask these questions, these why questions, you are trying to drill down to the reason that stakeholder wants you to have that requirement as part of the requirement for that solution. And sometimes when you realize that the reason that they've given is not justifiable, you can make a case for that particular requirement not to be part of what needs to be done. So we use the 5 why technique to drill down to the rationale for a particular reason or for a particular thing the customer or the user or the stakeholder has provided to us. Another elicitation question is where. In terms of where, you are trying to understand location, right? So where are our customers located? Where can users have access to this information? Where do you want this data to be stored? Where is this data going to be fetched from? Where will this action be performed? Where will this button be located? Where do you currently perform this activity or this task? And then the last one we'll be looking at today is the what questions. What question is very interesting because it helps to give your stakeholders, you have to give your stakeholders opportunity to talk and give you a lot more information. Things like, what problem are we trying to solve? What do you consider to be a success? What type of data are we going to be storing in the system? What is the current business process? What is the definition of done, right? What are the risks? What format are the data going to be stored? What are the key metrics you're going to be using to evaluate performance for this particular project? What are we going to be integrating to if the project involves integrating to a third-party platform? Or what are users complaining about the current process if you want to get user feedback on the process? Now, when doing interviews, when carrying out interview elicitation, you need to ensure we start with an open-ended question, right? And then after we've been able to gather all the customers' input, all the stakeholders' input from the open-ended question, we can now close the conversation with close-ended questions in order for us to validate our assumptions. So let's say, for instance, from what Michelle has given to us, she said that because her body has accustomed to eating by that time as a result of the places that she has worked in the past, right? Or where she currently works. Now, after I've been able to elicit this requirement from Michelle, for me to conclude my interview session with Michelle, it is important for me to ask close-ended questions as a follow-up to confirm my assumptions. So I'll say, so Michelle, I want to get from you. You said that you are having, you're not ready to have your lunch now because your body has been accustomed to having lunch around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Then she will give me a yes or no, right? So in that way, I'm trying to confirm the assumptions that I've gotten from the elicitations from the interview using my open-ended questions. Okay. Now, let's go ahead to communicating and collaborating with stakeholders during elicitation. And this is the last section of the class today. It's pretty much going to be brief. But before that, I don't know if you have any question about the elicitation questions.
I just want to confirm this.
Go ahead.
I'm thinking that the 5 whys can help with Moscow technique. Am I right?
Yes, it can help you to understand priority as well.
Okay,
so the Moscow technique is used for prioritization.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So it can help you to understand the priority of a particular requirement or the priority of a particular feature. If someone tell you that, oh, I want us to prioritize this requirement, you ask them, why do you want us to prioritize this requirement? They'll tell, well, I like the requirement. Why do you like the requirement? Should we just prioritize it because you like it? Right? So you help drill down to the reason why a stakeholder is prioritizing a requirement. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
All right. Communicating and collaborating with stakeholders during elicitation. After you must have elicited your requirement, it is important for you to communicate the results of your elicitation with stakeholders. The essence of communicating the elicitation results with stakeholders is for you to confirm your elicitation results. And there are two different ways we can basically confirm our elicitation results. Number one will be by comparing your elicitation results against the source information. So if you conducted an interview as a form of elicitation, one way for you to confirm your elicitation results is to compare your elicitation results against, send your elicitation results, send the elicitation results to your source information, to the person that you interviewed, and tell them to go through the result and confirm if everything they provided you has been captured in that elicitation result. So that is one way of confirming your elicitation results. Another way to confirm your elicitation result is to, compare your elicitation results against other elicitation results. So let's say, for instance, you had interviews with different stakeholders to elicit a particular requirement. So let's say you want to build, your company wants to build a health information management system for a medical facility. And then you are trying to elicit requirements for clinical processes. Now, you elicited requirements from the nursing department in terms of clinical processes. You elicited requirements from the general practitioner, the doctor. You elicited requirements from the specialist, example, the gynecologist, and you also elicited requirements from the pediatrician. Now, you want to be able to have a holistic, conclusive clinical process as an elicitation result. You can compare the information in terms of clinical process that the nurse, the doctor, the gynecologist, and the pediatrician, you can compare the clinical process they've given to you and look for points of synergy, points of alignment. And in that way, you can confirm your elicitation results. Also, in terms of collaborating or collaborating with stakeholders, it's very, very important for us to ensure that we constantly engage our stakeholders in the course of elicitation. And what I mean by this is that for the fact that you've elicited requirement doesn't mean that you stop your engagement with your stakeholders. You still need to share your requirement results with them. You also need to clarify requirements with them. You need to engage them with requirements. Even when there's an update or there's a change in the requirement, you need to communicate with them. So as new stakeholders are identified, their role, their influence, and their relationship needs to be analyzed. And you analyze all of these things based on who would provide me what information. So if we have a new person in the compliance team, you need to understand that this compliance person might not know the actual processes within the organization. You need to ensure that they are brought up to speed on the requirements that the compliance team has provided in the past. Poor relationship with stakeholders can have a lot of detrimental effects on the business analysis piece of work. And some of these effects could be one, failure to provide quality information. If you don't have good collaboration, or if you don't have a healthy collaboration with your stakeholders, they might choose not to provide you with all of the information you need for your work as a business analyst. It can also have strong negative reactions and setbacks and obstacles. Because of lack of cooperation or collaboration with your stakeholders, you might realize there are a lot of setbacks or obstacles that could occur or spring up in your relationship with your stakeholders. Another one is resistance to change as well. Poor collaboration or relationship with stakeholders would certainly lead to a lot of resistance to change. When you make a request for something to be done, they might want to resist or frustrate your request. And the last one is that most times, which is another common thing they do, is that they might want to ignore your business analysis information. So when you send them your requirement elicitation result for them to confirm, they might just want to ignore it. When you send them your surveys for them to provide responses to your surveys, they might just want to ignore it. when you send them a request on a documentation or an architecture you want them to provide you, they might just want to ignore it because of the poor relationship that you have with them. So that brings us to the end of the session today on eliciting requirement. It's actually pretty straightforward, but it's something that you're not so good at it at the get-go, but by the time you try over and over again and you walk through it over and over again, you realize that you improve your experience and you also improve your expertise in the project. So in requirement elicitation. So after this weekend, next weekend, we are going to start the projects that we're going to be working on, and we are starting with eliciting requirements. So that brings us to the end of the class today. I don't know if you have any question with respect to what we've discussed today on requirements elicitation, or if the class is clear to you guys.
Okay, it's clear. No questions from me.
Okay, I was about
okay.
thinking maybe you're having your lunch now, no more than 2 o'clock.
I'm okay too.
All right. I'm glad to know.